The sharp sound of shattering glass echoed through the quiet garage, jolting Mark from his thoughts. He rushed to the corner, where his 16-year-old stepson, Ethan, stood frozen, his face pale as he stared at the broken shards of an old picture frame scattered across the concrete floor. Mark's gaze shifted from Ethan to the contents of the frame, a faded photograph of Mark and Ethan's late mother, smiling on their wedding day. The boy's trembling hands clutched a pencil and a crumpled piece of paper, its edges smudged with graphite. "What happened here?" Mark asked, his voice firm but laced with concern. Ethan looked up, his eyes wide with fear, and mumbled, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. He hesitated, shoving the paper behind his back. Mark sighed, kneeling down to pick up the shattered glass. But his eyes caught a glimpse of the drawing Ethan had been hiding. It wasn't just a sketch. It was a stunning, lifelike portrait of the very photo that lay broken on the floor. The detail, the emotion in every stroke, took Mark's breath away. He looked up at his stepson, who was now anxiously avoiding his gaze, and realized there was far more to Ethan than he had ever imagined. Mark had never imagined himself as a stepfather. A rugged man in his late 40s, he had spent most of his life working as a mechanic in the small-town auto shop he inherited from his father. With grease-stained hands and an easygoing demeanor, Mark had built a reputation for being reliable and hardworking. But the steady rhythm of his life had shifted 5 years ago when he met Claire, a widow with a shy, artistic young son named Ethan. Their love story had been unexpected but beautiful, a second chance at happiness for both of them. When they married, Mark vowed to be the best father he could to Ethan, even if the boy kept his distance at first. Ethan was now 16, tall and lanky, with unruly dark hair that often fell into his eyes. He was an enigma to Mark, a quiet teenager who spent most of his time holed up in his room, sketching in notebooks or listening to music. They shared polite exchanges and the occasional laugh, but there was always a wall between them. After Claire's sudden passing 2 years ago, that wall seemed to grow taller. Mark had tried to reach out, but Ethan withdrew further, his grief manifesting in silence and solitude. The house they shared was modest but cozy, a single-story home nestled at the edge of town. The garage, with its rows of tools and half-finished car projects, was Mark's sanctuary. It was where he poured his energy, finding solace in fixing engines and restoring old vehicles. Ethan, on the other hand, preferred the quiet corners of his bedroom or the small attic space, where he kept his art supplies and stacks of sketchbooks. Though Mark had done his best to provide for Ethan, financial struggles had become a constant worry. The auto shop, once thriving, was barely breaking even in the face of new competitors. Bills piled up on the kitchen counter, and Mark often found himself lying awake at night, wondering how he could give Ethan the future he deserved. He wanted to be the father Ethan needed, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was falling short. Outside their home, the town was small and tightly knit, where everyone knew each other's names. Neighbors often stopped by to check on Mark and Ethan, offering casseroles or kind words. Yet behind their smiles, Mark knew they whispered about how the boy had grown so quiet since his mother's passing, how Mark was struggling to keep things together. As Mark stood in the garage that evening, staring at the extraordinary portrait Ethan had drawn, he realized just how little he truly knew about his stepson's world. And in that moment, he felt an unshakable resolve to bridge the gap between them, no matter what it took. The sound of rain pattered softly against the windows as Mark sat in the dimly lit kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee. His thoughts drifted to Ethan's drawing from the garage earlier that day. The image was seared into his mind. The intricate detail, the raw emotion, the unmistakable talent. How had he missed the side of Ethan? Mark wasn't an art expert by any means, but even he could tell that what Ethan had created was far beyond ordinary. Lost in thought, Mark nearly missed the soft creak of the attic stairs. He glanced toward the hallway as Ethan's shadow flickered on the wall. The boy didn't usually venture out at this hour. Curious, Mark set his coffee down and followed quietly, careful not to make a sound. As he approached the attic door, He heard the faint scratch of pencil on paper, accompanied by the occasional rustle of pages. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap, Mark caught sight of Ethan, hunched over a sketch pad under the glow of a single desk lamp. The walls around him were plastered with drawings, portraits, landscapes, and abstract pieces, all breathtakingly detailed. Mark's heart clenched. This wasn't a hobby. It was a gift. But what truly caught Mark's attention was a stack of envelopes on the corner of Ethan's desk. The top one was addressed to a prestigious art academy in the city, a place Mark had heard of only in passing, known for cultivating some of the best artists in the country. The envelope was sealed, but the others beneath it weren't, revealing rejection letters from the same school dated over the past 2 years. Mark stepped back, his mind racing. Ethan had been applying to the school in secret, facing rejection after rejection without ever saying a word. How had Mark not noticed the weight Ethan had been carrying? And why hadn't the boy come to him for support? Before Mark could retreat, the floorboard beneath him creaked. Ethan's head shot up, his wide eyes locking onto Mark in the doorway. "What are you doing up here?" Ethan's voice was sharp, defensive. He hurriedly closed the sketch pad, his movements quick and panicked. Mark raised his hands in surrender. "I wasn't trying to pry. I didn't know you were doing all this." He gestured toward the drawings on the walls. Ethan's jaw tightened. "It's nothing. Just forget about it." But Mark couldn't forget. As he left the attic, questions swirled in his mind. Why had Ethan kept his passion a secret? And what could he do to help his stepson find the confidence to pursue his dreams? That night, Mark resolved to uncover the truth and take action, no matter how hard it might be. The next morning, Mark woke up with a plan. For years, he had focused on being a steady presence in Ethan's life. But it was clear that Ethan needed more than stability. He needed someone who believed in him. Mark decided it was time to step into that role, even if it meant stepping outside his comfort zone. After breakfast, Mark approached Ethan carefully. "You know, I couldn't stop thinking about your drawings last night," he said, keeping his tone casual. "They're incredible. Why didn't you ever tell me you were this talented?" Ethan shrugged, avoiding eye contact as he pushed his cereal around the bowl. "It's just something I do. It's not a big deal." Mark frowned. "It is a big deal, Ethan. I saw that letter to the Art Academy. You've been trying to get in, haven't you?" Ethan froze, his shoulders stiffening. "I already told you to forget about it." Mark hesitated, realizing he had to tread carefully. "Look, I'm not trying to pry. I want to help. If you'll let me." Ethan's gaze flicked up for a brief moment before he looked away again. "You can't help, okay? They don't want me. I've already been rejected 3 times. Mark felt a pang in his chest. "Maybe they didn't see what I saw last night. Maybe you just need to try again. Show them something even better." Ethan scoffed, his frustration boiling over. "You don't get it. They want perfect portfolios. Kids with fancy art teachers and connections. I'm just some nobody who draws in his attic." Mark didn't know what to say. He wasn't an artist, and he didn't have connections to fancy schools. But he couldn't let Ethan give up so easily. "Maybe you're right," Mark admitted. "Maybe I don't get it. But what I do know is that you're not a nobody. You're my stepson, and you've got more talent in your pinky than most people have in their whole bodies. If you want this, we'll figure it out together." Ethan didn't respond, but Mark noticed a flicker of something, maybe hope, in his eyes before the boy retreated to his room. Over the next few weeks, Mark made it his mission to support Ethan in any way he could. He started small, bringing home art supplies he found on sale, and leaving them on Ethan's desk without comment. At first, Ethan ignored them, but eventually, Mark noticed the supplies disappearing, replaced by new drawings on the attic walls. One afternoon, Mark stopped by the town library on his lunch break. He found himself at the computer, searching for information about art academies and portfolio requirements. He printed out articles and guides, determined to learn as much as he could. The librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Avery, noticed his struggle and approached with a kind smile. Planning a career change, Mark, she teased. He chuckled. Not for me. It's for Ethan, my stepson. He's got this incredible talent, but he doesn't think he's good enough. I just want to help him prove to himself that he is. Mrs. Avery's eyes softened. Sounds like you're a good stepdad. Let me know if you need any help. Her words stayed with Mark as he continued his research. The more he learned, the more he realized that helping Ethan wouldn't be easy. Creating a portfolio would take time, effort, and guidance, things Mark wasn't sure he could provide on his own. One evening, Mark sat down with Ethan after dinner. I've been looking into our portfolios, he said. You need something that really shows who you are and what you can do. Ethan looked skeptical. And how am I supposed to do that? It's not like we can afford some fancy teacher. Mark hesitated, then took a deep breath. What if we found someone who could help? Maybe not a fancy teacher, but someone who knows about art. There's got to be someone in town. Ethan's expression softened, but he still seemed hesitant. You'd really do that? For me? Of course, Mark said, his voice steady. I believe in you, Ethan. It's time you believed in yourself, too. The search for help wasn't easy. Mark asked around town, called old acquaintances, and even posted on social media. Finally, a lead came from an unexpected source, Mrs. Avery. She introduced Mark to a retired art professor named Mr. Caldwell, who had moved to the town a few years ago. Mr. Caldwell was initially reluctant to take on a student, but when Mark showed him one of Ethan's sketches, his eyes lit up. This boy is raw talent, he said, but he'll need discipline and direction if he wants to take it further. Mark arranged a meeting between Ethan and Mr. Caldwell. Though Ethan was nervous at first, he quickly warmed to the older man, who treated him with respect and enthusiasm. They began working together on weekends, building a portfolio that showcased Ethan's unique style and voice. Progress wasn't always smooth. Ethan struggled with self-doubt, especially when Mr. Caldwell pushed him to try new techniques or step outside his comfort zone. One particularly difficult session ended with Ethan storming out of the studio, leaving Mark to find him sitting on the porch, staring at the stars. I can't do this, Ethan muttered. I'm not good enough. Mark sat beside him, his voice gentle. You don't have to be perfect, Ethan. You just have to keep trying. Every great artist started somewhere. Ethan glanced at him, his frustration softening. Do you really think I can do this? Mark smiled. I know you can, and I'll be right here every step of the way. As the weeks turned into months, Ethan's confidence began to grow. He started spending more time in the studio, experimenting with colors, textures, and new subjects. Mr. Caldwell guided him with a firm but encouraging hand, and Mark was always there to cheer him on. Finally, the day came to submit the portfolio to the Art Academy. Ethan's hands shook as he sealed the envelope, and Mark clapped a reassuring hand on his shoulder. No matter what happens, I'm proud of you, he said. Ethan nodded, his eyes shining with a mix of fear and determination. Thanks, Mark, for everything. As they dropped the envelope into the mailbox, Mark felt a swell of pride. This wasn't just about getting into a school. It was about Ethan finding his voice and believing in himself. And no matter the outcome, Mark knew they had already won. The day the letter arrived, the house was unusually quiet. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, the envelope from the Art Academy clutched in his trembling hands. Mark stood nearby, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, unsure of what to say. He could see the fear in Ethan's eyes, the doubt that had been gnawing at him for months. You don't have to open it right now, Mark said gently, though the suspense was eating him alive. Ethan shook his head. No, I need to know. He took a deep breath and carefully tore the envelope open. As he unfolded the letter, his eyes darted across the page, scanning the words. For a moment, his expression was unreadable, and then he slowly placed the letter on the table, his hands shaking. Mark's heart sank. Ethan, what is it? Did they accepted me, Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. He looked up at Mark, his eyes wide with disbelief. They actually accepted me. For a split second, there was silence as the words hung in the air. Then, without thinking, Mark let out a loud whoop and pulled Ethan into a bear hug. "You did it. I knew you could," he exclaimed, his voice thick with emotion. But instead of celebrating, Ethan's face crumpled and he pulled away, shaking his head. "I can't go, Mark." Mark froze, his joy replaced by confusion. "What are you talking about? This is everything you've been working for." Ethan's voice cracked as he spoke. "We can't afford it. The tuition, the supplies, living in the city, it's too much. I know how tight money is, and I can't ask you to do this." Mark's chest tightened as he watched the boy crumble under the weight of his selflessness. Ethan had worked so hard, poured his heart and soul into this dream, and now he was willing to let it go to protect them both from financial strain. It wasn't fair. Mark felt a surge of anger, not at Ethan, but at the world for making him feel like he wasn't worth the investment. "Ethan," Mark said, his voice steady, "you're not asking me for anything. This is about your future, and I'll be damned if I let you throw it away because you're worried about me." "But how?" Ethan asked, his voice breaking. "We don't have that kind of money." Mark hesitated, the weight of the challenge pressing on him. He didn't have an easy answer, but he knew he couldn't let Ethan give up. "We'll figure it out. I'll work extra hours. I'll sell one of the cars I've been restoring. Whatever it takes, we'll make it happen." Ethan stared at him, his eyes filling with tears. "You do that? For me?" Mark stepped closer, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Of course I would. You're my son, Ethan, and I believe in you. It's about time you start believing in yourself, too." Ethan broke down then, collapsing into Mark's arms as the tears spilled freely. Mark held him tightly, his own emotions threatening to overwhelm him. In that moment, he realized just how far they had both come, not just Ethan but himself. For the first time, he felt like he wasn't just Ethan's stepdad. He was his father, in every way that mattered. That night, as Ethan sat at his desk, sketching with a newfound determination, Mark picked up his phone and started making calls. He didn't know how he would pull it off, but he would find a way. For Ethan, for the dream, for everything they had built together, Mark was ready to move mountains. Over the next few weeks, Mark threw himself into making Ethan's dream a reality. He worked late nights at the shop, taking on extra repair jobs, and finally deciding to sell his prized vintage car, a project he had spent years restoring. It wasn't an easy decision, but every time he thought about Ethan standing at the threshold of a new life, it felt worth it. The day the sale went through, Mark handed Ethan the check with a smile. "This should cover the first semester's tuition and housing. We'll figure out the rest as we go." Ethan stared at the check in disbelief, his voice trembling. "Mark, you didn't have to do this. I don't know how I can ever repay you." Mark placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You don't need to repay me, son. Just go out there, give it everything you've got, and show the world what I already know, that you're something special." Ethan nodded, tears welling up in his eyes, but this time they were tears of gratitude and hope. "I won't let you down." When the day came for Ethan to leave for the city, the atmosphere in their small home was bittersweet. Mark helped Ethan pack his bags and load them into the car, all the while offering bits of fatherly advice about city life. "Don't forget to eat. Call me if you need anything. And don't let anyone tell you that you don't belong there, because you do." Ethan smiled, his nervousness melting away under Mark's steady reassurance. "I'll call. And, Mark, thank you for everything. I wouldn't be here without you." Mark gave him a firm hug, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't need to thank me, kid. You've earned this." As they pulled into the city and approached the art academy, Ethan's eyes widened at the sight of the sprawling campus, with its grand buildings and bustling students. Mark parked the car and helped unload the bags, feeling a mix of pride and sadness. This was Ethan's moment, but it marked the start of a new chapter for both of them. Before they parted, Mark handed Ethan a small notebook. "This is for your sketches," he said. "Every time you feel stuck or unsure, just draw something. Remember why you're here." Ethan smiled, clutching the notebook tightly. "I will. I promise." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind for Ethan. The academy was everything he had dreamed of and more. The classes were challenging, the competition fierce. But Ethan threw himself into his work with a passion he hadn't known he had. He found a mentor in one of his professors, who quickly recognized his talent and encouraged him to push his boundaries. Back home, Mark kept up his busy schedule at the shop, but his evenings were quieter without Ethan around. He filled the silence by working on new car projects and keeping in touch with Ethan through phone calls and video chats. Hearing about Ethan's progress, the praise from professors, the new techniques he was learning, the friendships he was forming, filled Mark with a sense of pride he couldn't put into words. One evening, Mark received a call from Ethan that left him stunned. "Mark, there's this national art competition coming up. My professor thinks I should enter. The winner gets a scholarship that could cover the rest of my tuition." "That's incredible, Ethan," Mark said, his excitement spilling through the phone. "You're going to crush it." "I'm nervous," Ethan admitted, "but I'm going to give it my all." For weeks, Ethan poured his heart into creating a piece for the competition. He chose to draw a portrait of Mark, his rough hands resting on the hood of a car, his face weathered yet kind, and his eyes reflecting a lifetime of sacrifice and love. Every stroke of the pencil was infused with gratitude for the man who had believed in him when no one else did. The day of the competition arrived, and Ethan's piece was displayed among dozens of other entries in a gallery packed with people. Mark made the 2-hour drive to be there, standing quietly in the back as judges moved from one artwork to the next. When they stopped in front of Ethan's piece, Mark felt his heart pound. He could see the emotion on their faces as they examined the intricate details and the story the portrait told. When the winners were announced, Ethan's name was called for first place. The room erupted in applause, and Mark felt tears sting his eyes as Ethan took the stage, his face a mixture of shock and joy. The scholarship would not only secure his place at the academy, but also validate all the hard work and sacrifices they had both made. Later that evening, Ethan found Mark in the crowd, holding the certificate in one hand and the portrait in the other. "I couldn't have done this without you," he said, his voice trembling. Mark pulled him into a hug, his pride overflowing. "You did this, Ethan. You believed in yourself, and you made it happen." In the months and years that followed, Ethan continued to thrive. His artwork gained recognition, and he began building a career that once seemed like a distant dream. Every milestone, a gallery showing, a published piece, a glowing review, was a testament to the journey he and Mark had shared. Back at home, the portrait Ethan had drawn of Mark hung proudly in the shop, a constant reminder of the bond between them. Customers often asked about it, and Mark would smile, saying, "That's my boy. He's got a talent the world needed to see." For Ethan and Mark, the journey wasn't just about art or success. It was about finding each other, building a relationship rooted in trust, love, and belief. And as they looked back on how far they had come, they knew that the greatest masterpiece they had created was the family they had built together. 5 years later, Mark stood in the middle of a bustling art gallery, his eyes sweeping over the crowd gathered around Ethan's latest exhibition. The walls were adorned with vibrant paintings, each one telling a story of resilience, passion, and growth. Ethan moved through the crowd with ease, shaking hands, sharing laughs, and pausing to explain the inspiration behind each piece. His confidence was unrecognizable from the shy teenager who once hid his sketches in the attic. Ethan's success had grown beyond their wildest dreams. Featured articles in art magazines, invitations to exhibit across the country, and even a teaching position at the academy where it all began. Yet, despite his rising fame, Ethan always credited his journey to one person, Mark. Mark watched with pride as a young artist approached Ethan, eyes wide with admiration. Ethan listened intently, offering advice and encouragement, just as Mr. Caldwell once had for him. It was clear that Ethan wasn't just sharing art. He was sharing hope, inspiring others to believe in their own dreams. Later that evening, Ethan found Mark standing alone, gazing at a portrait, one Ethan had painted specifically for this exhibition. It was a painting of the old garage, sunlight streaming through dusty windows, with two figures, father and son, working side by side. Ethan wrapped an arm around Mark's shoulder. "None of this would have happened without you." Mark's eyes shimmered with emotion. "No, you did this. I just gave you a nudge." As they stood together, Mark felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not just for the art or the success, but for the family they had become. Together, they had created a masterpiece that transcended any canvas, a bond that would endure long after the paint had dried.